Joining me today for the interview is Dr. Caltin Tucker. Caltin is a best-selling author. She is an international trainer and keynote speaker. Currently, Caltin is working as a blended learning coach. She is an educational consultant and also a professor in the Master of Arts in Teaching program at Pepperdine University. Caltin has a series of books, best-selling books on blended learning. There's Balanced with Blended Learning in Action, Power Up Blended Learning, and also blended learning in grades 4 to 12. So you can guess what we're going to talk about today. So I've been looking forward to that. Caltin, welcome to the Tom Schimmer podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, great to have you here. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time. You're a very popular educator, and certainly trying to get you into the schedule was a challenge, but I'm grateful that you've taken the time to be here today. And obviously, you know, over the last year, I'm sure that you have noticed that blended learning through COVID, there's been an increased heightened awareness of what blended learning can certainly offer the educational experience for students. So we're going to talk about that and explore that today. But I want to begin with your journey. You, of course, like most of us, began as a classroom teacher. So the question is, why blended learning? Like, how did that become the passion, and how do you end up here as an internationally recognized expert and as an internationally recognized leader in blended learning? How did that happen?
Well, I credit blended learning for the fact that I'm in education right now, because I was about 5 years into my teaching career, and I just remember feeling super disillusioned with this profession. It was nowhere near the kind of fantasy I had concocted of being a teacher when I was studying in credential school. And I was tired. Kids didn't want to engage. They didn't seem particularly excited to be in my class. And I definitely felt like I was failing. I was failing to engage them and create this classroom I dreamed about. And I remember thinking, maybe I've made just like an enormous mistake. This might not be the profession for me. And it was a late decision. And I was almost done with college when I pivoted from law to education. And so I thought maybe I made the wrong choice. And it was in that moment of career crisis when I was thinking about changing course that I decided to just push pause and have a baby. So I had my first child and figured I'll just take a year off and, you know, be a mom, a stay-at-home mom. And I always joke that, like, I very quickly realized there is a much harder job than dealing with a room full of disgruntled teenagers, and being a mom, a stay-at-home mom with an infant is harder. So I spent that year at home, and I started teaching college level writing courses just as a way to make some extra income, mental stimulation. And that was where my interest in technology was piqued. And after my year as a stay-at-home mom, when I did go back to the classroom, I very much approached it as one more year. I'm going to give it one more year. I am going to just use my classroom like an experimental laboratory and start integrating some of these things that seemed like they had potential in my online classes, and we'll see what happens. And what happened was that my entire experience as an educator was transformed. And it started slowly. I made lots of mistakes, but the immediate impact on my students' engagement was thrilling. And for me, that opened up the door to the path I've been on for the last 10 or 12 years. And really, I just started writing books, sharing kind of strategies I learned through error and kind of correction, resources I developed. I started speaking at conferences, and I don't know, 10 years later, here I am. And working with teachers all over the globe on trying to shift practices.
It's funny when you talk about that, because it's always interesting when I speak to many people in who do consulting and speaking. They always talk about how there was never a master plan. It just sort of happens one step at a time, right? It's this conference, then it's that conference, it's that request, and then the audiences get bigger and the travel gets longer, and pretty soon you are that expert. And there's no question, Caltin, that you are a recognized expert in the area of blended learning. I'm interested in you say that your epiphany occurred when you changed the way you approached feedback, assessment, and parent communication. And I found that really interesting. So let's explore that for a moment. What was your epiphany, and why was feedback, assessment, why were parents' feedback and assessment so crucial to making that occur? How did that manifest?
I think my real epiphany, so I had been using blended learning models for quite a while. And I had this moment where I was realizing I was still the person doing the lion's share of the work in the classroom and recognizing that that was a problem, right?
Mhm.
So in the class, really, I see the teacher's job as one, being architect of learning experiences, right? We design these learning experiences ideally to position students as active agents at the center of learning. And so as active agents at the center of learning, they need to do the hard work of making meaning and constructing knowledge, both through individual and social processes. And I was still doing too much of that heavy lifting for them. And
Mhm.
it was really about thinking through, really leaning on the models. Like, how do I lean on them to pull some of these aspects of my work that are so time consuming and draining still, like giving feedback, communicating with parents, assessing student work? Why am I doing all of that work in isolation? Why is that all falling on me when in actuality, I need to start really prioritizing the process when it comes to feedback. I'd like to be giving feedback as students are working so that they're not getting feedback on finished products. They're getting feedback in the moment so they can make adjustments and improve what will be a finished product. And I had to think about, how do I create space with these models to dedicate time to that process? And then how do I do the same thing when I want to sit down and actually assess student work? So if they have spent time writing an essay, working on a project, why would I take that all home and grade it in secret and hand these grades back to kids? Why wouldn't I figure out how to lean on a playlist, lean on a rotation to pull kids and have a conversation, conduct a think aloud as I'm assessing their work so they have total clarity on why they're getting the grades they're getting? Because for a lot of kids, the grades are kind of still a mystery. And then the parent communication piece, I'm teaching high school students, and even as a coach of elementary teachers who work with younger learners, I think they need to develop the skills, students at a variety of age levels, to be able to own the conversation about their progress, to tell their parents, hey, this is what I'm working on this week. This is what I'm really proud of. This is what I'm struggling. Or, hey, we're working on this assignment. I'm a couple steps behind. This is why. Here's my plan for catching up. Like, how can one teacher be responsible for owning 30 to 150 of those conversations? So I think for me, it was really about starting to ask the question of, who's doing the work in this room, in this class, who really should be doing the work, and how do I start to partner with students and lean on these models to create space and time and routines that really allow me to connect with learners and for learners to take a much more active role in these pieces of their learning journey.
Yeah, as you were answering there, you remind me of just one of my favorite moments in my work around assessment, which was actually sitting in an audience and listening to Rick Stiggins talk about, and the thing that he said on stage that I will never forget was, the person doing the assessing is the person doing the learning. And I thought to myself, that is such a great way to look at it, because so
Mhm.
often we as teachers sit at the center, and we control, for sometimes for the wrong reasons, but a lot of times for the right reasons, because we want to do the right work with students, and yet we end up doing such a disproportionate amount of the work. And you're absolutely spot on, I think, when you talk about the lack of transparency. And again, it's not a cynical approach, it's just sometimes students don't know, like, how did you come up with this grade? Like, where did my
Mhm.
grade come from? So I
Mhm.
love the idea of kind of pulling back the curtain, and I think we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go through, for sure. But along a little bit of that thread with students, you talk about personalized learning, and you make a nice distinction, I think, between blended learning and personalized learning. And yet you talk about the idea that blended learning offers a pathway to personalized learning, but that they're not the same. So I'm wondering if you could first, for listeners, draw the distinction between blended learning and personalized learning as you sort of articulated, and then walk us through that pathway. Walk us through how blended learning leads to a personalized learning model for students.
Yeah. So, one of the things that has been kind of frustrating for me, quite frankly, this year with the pandemic and this sudden shifts and pivots in education, is the phrase blended learning has been thrown around quite a bit, and not always in a way that I'm thrilled about.
Mhm.
So, I'm very clear when I work with leadership teams and teachers and coaches. I define blended learning as active engaged learning online combined with active engaged learning offline. And blended learning is an umbrella term. So there's lots of different models and ways to combine this online and offline learning. But ideally, we are focused on positioning that student as active agent. And so the various models are incredibly useful to shift the focus to the learner. But
Mhm.
when we talk about personalized learning, that's something we do with our students. That really involves a partnership where we have opportunities to meet with learners, conference with them, talk about their progress, figure out what adjustments need to be made in order to personalize their experience. There's no way for a teacher to just magically know what every learner needs. There has to be that partnership with the learner in order to
Mhm.
figure out how do we customize your specific learning path to meet your specific needs. And so blended learning models are great, but you can have a station rotation, you can use flipped classroom, you can even create a playlist that is not personalized to a
Right.
learner's needs. However, you can have a playlist where you have inserted kind of teacher checks or moments where when students reach a particular part of the playlist, they pause and they know they have to meet with you for a conference. And then the goal of that conference can be, hey, let's look at what you've done in this playlist so far. Let's take a look at any informal data that you've produced, or, if they have formative assessment checks built in throughout, let's look at your work. Let's have a conversation about where are you feeling strong? Where you feel like you're struggling? Where do you need support? How might we need to modify and adapt this playlist to help you continue making progress? And so
Mhm.
that's an opportunity, in my opinion, to think about personalization in a sustainable way, where we take the model and then we start to figure out where within that model are we making time to have conversations with individual learners about their specific needs.
You use the word customization, which I really love because I think sometimes teachers will hear the word personalized learning or the words personalized learning and immediately go to the notion of individualized learning plan and sort of the students all just sort of carving their own pathway forward. And a lot of
Right.
teachers get intimidated by that idea, thinking,
Mm-hmm.
does that mean I now have to navigate? So is that the distinction that you made? Like how would you respond to a teacher who says, Catlin, listen, I get what you're saying about personalized learning, but I've got 35 students in my classroom right now. How am I supposed to personalize? So that word customization, is that I picked up on that. Is that your
I think,
distinction?
well, I think it's more about, okay, are we building in meaningful choice, right? Because
Yeah.
a student can start to personalize their experience if they have authentic, meaningful choice built into the design of the learning experiences.
Mhm.
And then for me, it's about that partnership and that conversation that we have with kids, where we together can figure out, how do we customize this experience for you?
Mhm.
What adjustments do we need to make for you?
Right.
It's not about necessarily every student going in a totally different direction on their own. And it's
Right.
also not like, oh, I use adaptive software and now I've personalized their experience. I think
Right.
it's a more complicated conversation than any
Yeah.
one piece.
Yeah. So partnerships, you talk about the importance of partnerships, and that's a big part of what you write about, what you talk about for sure. So blended learning, all about partnerships, and at its core, it's about a shift in power from the teacher to the learner. So I want to split this next question kind of into two parts and begin first with maybe somewhat of a negative spin, which is that there are some teachers, I'm not saying this is most or the majority, but there are some teachers who are simply unwilling to relinquish any kind of control in their classroom, um, in terms of trying to create that partnership. So, why do you think people are so hesitant? Why are teachers so reluctant to at least try to build some kind of partnership with students? Like, what do you think is stopping them from doing that?
I think the one of the biggest reasons teachers don't want to relinquish control to learners is fear, right? If we don't, there's a lack of trust. What will students do with that? What decisions will they make? How will they use their time?
Mhm.
And the reality is, we can't make students learn. We can only create an environment and provide opportunities for them to learn. And they are much more likely to lean into those opportunities, into those experiences, if they enjoy a degree of agency and autonomy, which
Mhm.
means we have to be willing to let go of some of that control. It doesn't mean we have to give control over everything all the time, but we have to start giving students the agency to make key decisions about their learning, have the space, quite frankly, to start developing their self regulation skills. So when I work with teachers and I hear things, students are so disengaged, students aren't motivated. One of the things I'm always thinking is, well, are they disengaged because they don't feel like the learning is interesting or relevant, because they don't have any opportunities to kind of look through a lens of interest or make decisions about how they approach something? I think that for a lot of students is where they begin to get disenchanted with education, because there are kids who sit in classrooms, physical, virtual, blended, whatever, who don't get to make a single decision all day long. And that has devastating impact on their motivation over time. So
Yeah.
I think of it, a lot of it's fear, but in fearing what they will do by not, if we were to relinquish control and by holding on even tighter, I think we end up creating a lot of the behaviors and the challenges that are so frustrating as teachers, where
Yeah.
students really aren't invested and they're not super engaged in the process.
Right. I think you're spot on with that in terms of just fear of the unknown. What would it look like? Fear of the wasting time, and a lot of there is that pressure of time that teachers feel,
Mhm.
and certainly what will students do with that time, and will they be productive, and all of that. It can get down a bit of a cynical look at learners, and thinking that if I don't control the situation, they won't do it or they won't do anything and things like that. But I don't think that's the majority for sure. But there is that reluctance to give up some of that control. But the second part of the question for me, which is what I think the vast majority of teachers, I think this is more where people are with blended learning and partnership, et cetera, is that they have the willingness to foster those partnerships and the willingness to engage in the work, but they don't know where to begin. I think a lot of teachers, I think the majority, I don't know if you would agree with that, but I think the majority have the will, but they're not sure how to begin. So let's think about that expression, think big, start small, right?
Mhm.
So what are some of the most important first steps that teachers can take in terms of starting to build that kind of partnership with their students?
Yeah, well, in trainings, that's almost always how I end. We cover a lot of ground in trainings, and I remind them, like, you do not need to do all of this right now, right? You
Right.
choose the thing that for you really resonated. So, if you're a teacher who feels a lot of pressure to be at the front of the room, orchestrating the experience, right? Providing instruction, modeling, giving kids directions for how to complete tasks. Well, maybe your first step is exploring the role of video in that, right? So if you're
Mhm.
going to say the same thing the same way to everybody, be it instruction, a model, directions, maybe that's an opportunity to play around with making a video and allowing kids to control the pace, because as they kind of self pace through a video, we all of a sudden get a little bit more freed up in that room. We can move around. I think honestly, the biggest barrier to connecting with students in a classroom is just the amount of time teachers talk. And there's a lot of pressure to feel like we have to cover a lot of ground, explain a ton of concepts. And so I get it. So maybe that's a first step. If I'm in an elementary classroom and I have a really diverse group of learners, skills, abilities, language proficiencies, then maybe I start with station rotation, because I really want to be able to spend time with small groups of learners, drilling into what they specifically need. So typically, I just say, choose one model, the one that speaks to your specific need as a teacher, and play around with it. Know you are going to make mistakes. You're going to stumble, you're going to fail, and that has to be okay. And I actually think it's a great thing for kids to see us experiment and fail, because how often do we put them on the spot in a class and ask them to take a risk and potentially fail? So for me, like you ask how I got here in blended learning to this expertise, I mean, I almost feel like it's just years of making one mistake after another, like looking at that mistake, figuring out how to
Yeah.
not make it again or how to improve the experience for learners. What supports
Mhm.
or scaffolds can I design to make it go more smoothly next time? And then just kind of continuing to make progress forward. And that's all we can do. So start small, choose one strategy, one model, play with it. And once you feel confident, then you can add.
Yeah. I I think it's all in almost any endeavor, just the idea of picking one strategy, refining it, getting good at it, getting comfortable with it, and then beginning to expand your repertoire is always good
Yes.
advice. The other thing that I love about what you talk about is building a culture of reciprocity within the classroom. So I love that. Can you talk a little bit about, what do you mean by that, and how does that grow within a classroom?
Well, I talk a lot about more like a community of learning, right?
Okay.
So
Yeah.
all of my work is grounded in like the community of inquiry and like how do we really tap into this like collective potential in this room? And so for me, again, in order to really develop a community of learners where students are engaging with each other, with the teacher, they're learning with and from each other, that also requires a degree of letting go as an
Mhm.
educator and just acknowledging that we as a collective, we as a class have so much more potential than any one member, including the teacher. And so, how do we foster that relationship building? How do we help students to develop their social presence, their willingness to kind of assert their social and emotional selves in this learning environment and take risks to construct and confirm meaning together? And so there's so many different pieces that are in play with that, but the teacher is fundamental to the development of that community of inquiry and fostering the connections between those learners so they feel safe engaging with each other and taking risks and sharing ideas and being vulnerable in this space, which is, in my opinion, all essential to a really deep learning experience and a high
Right.
functioning community of learners.
Yeah, that's what it's really all leading to, right? Is to create the conditions, remove the barriers, create the conditions, and
Yes.
allow students to get to that deeper learning. Speaking of depth, you draw such an important connection between blended learning, right? The partnerships, the shift in power. You draw a great connection between blended learning and metacognition. And I think obviously in 2021, I think we are at a place where teachers more than ever understand and are aware of the impact that metacognition has on student learning and how important it is. The dilemma for most is often the time. Like, in other words, we know it matters, but it's hard to make the time, find the time, create the space in order to include metacognitive activities and exercises into our daily routines. So what is it about the blended learning model that creates a more seamless opportunity for metacognition to become more habitual?
I mean, I don't know if it's the blended learning piece so much as it is when we embrace blended learning as educators, it demands a higher level of intentionality behind
Okay.
our design work, which a lot of teachers at first are like, that's a lot. It's going to take
Right.
time. And I'm like, at first, for sure, there's a learning curve. But with that intentionality and with this recognition that really, to truly be our partners in this learning journey, students must be comfortable thinking about their thinking and thinking
Mhm.
about their learning. So, whether it is a teacher who says, okay, I start every class with a welcome task. Well, welcome tasks are often bell ringers or do nows, but like, why couldn't be Monday? Set a goal for this week. What is it academically, personally, behaviorally you want to work on? And spend 10 minutes fleshing out exactly what you're going to do, actions, behaviors this week to try to accomplish this goal. And
Mhm.
maybe we start by saying, hey, last week we did this assignment. I want you to take a look at it with a critical eye, use this simple rubric, and self assess this piece, right? So, whether it's pulling it into something like a welcome routine, or whether, like I did in my own classroom, once a week, an online station and a station rotation, which ran about 25 minutes, was open up your ongoing self-assessment document and select a piece, your choice, student agency, right? Like which piece
Right.
do you want to examine with that critical eye? And then complete a self-assessment and tell me, why are you putting yourself at a particular level of this on this scale toward mastery? Like, what are you seeing in your work that is informing this choice? And where might you need additional support? So it's about building in routines, and it does take time. But you know
Yeah.
what? We make time for things we value in a classroom. And if what we value is cultivating independent learners who can develop their metacognitive muscles, their self-regulation skills, then we have to recognize this is time well spent, even if it's not in a pacing guide, even if it's not in our standards.
Yeah. I love that, and certainly that opportunity to create conversations through that self-assessment model and the self-regulation of learning. We know that connection, that self-assessment or assessment in general can really feed the self-regulation of learning process. And in reverse, we know that because students are, it's interesting because as students are engaged in more metacognition, we know that that has an impact on their results as well. And so hard to find the time, but we know how important it is. And I love the idea of building in routines. I'm a big routine guy. So the idea of just sort of, here's my routine, here's the regular rotation, here's kind of how we engage in the work. I think that's really great advice on how to kind of start to, because I think once you get refined at it, you can sort of do it in a little more loose fashion. But early on, having that kind of predictable routine around it doesn't mean you're not being creative or thoughtful. It just means that you keep reminding yourself to review back there. I love that. And I want to circle. So speaking of self-assessment, I want to circle back to assessment in general, because as listeners know, assessment is obviously an area for me of great importance and focus in the work that I do. So I'm really interested in your perspective on assessment. So how does assessment specifically change, expand, evolve in a blended learning model? What are some of the key aspects that teachers can either, will either anticipate as they begin to embark upon this journey, or in the midst of developing their blended learning models, what are some things they might experience from an assessment perspective?
I just want teachers to stop using grades and points as carrots. I think I cannot tell you how many times I have run, say, a station rotation
Mhm.
session, and you can just see the wheels turning. And then somebody will say, how do you grade this all? And I'm kind of like, e-break, what are we grading? Why are we grading it?
Yeah.
So, yes, there are 4 stations. Does that mean students have to pop out a product at every station that we need to assess? No. And one of the things I've written about, you probably saw it in my book, was
Yeah.
really this very simple flow chart that I began to use when I recognized, hey, I'm telling students that learning is a process. But you know what? I'm so overloaded by grading and putting
Mhm.
points on everything that I actually am not giving anybody an opportunity to revisit, revise, improve, resubmit, because I can't handle it, because I'm
Right.
slapping points on things that quite frankly don't need points on them. So for me, I had to take a step back and start really asking myself, why are you grading that? Right? If it's practice and review, why would I grade that? Like, kids
Yeah.
need a safe space to fail. Instead, put them in groups, pair them strategically, give them an answer key, give them an exemplar and a rubric, and ask them to look at that review and practice and figure out, what is it telling them about their skills and their abilities and what they might need as learners. And if it's work toward a process, don't allocate points for every step along the way. Really focus on giving them focused, actionable feedback so that when they get to the end of whatever this process is, they have a stronger product. And if we start to kind of scale back just the volume of things that we are feeling like we need to grade, assess, put points on, and we really focus on assessments, finished products, then all of a sudden, if a kid gets an assessment score or a grade on a finished product and they're devastated, they're like, oh my gosh, this is not okay. Like, I know I can do better. Then we have the bandwidth to say, all right, do better. Go back and keep working with this essay. Feel free to refine this part of this project. I'm happy to reassess it. I have the bandwidth because I'm not running around putting points on everything because I'm scared if I don't, kids won't do the work.
Right. Right. I was just going to ask you that because I know I get that. I get this statement or this assertion all the time. So I'm curious as to what your response is to folks when they say, Catlin, if I don't grade it, they won't do it. How do you respond to that?
I disagree. I
me,
fundamentally disagree.
me
And
too.
it's not an easy answer. What I say to them is, and it's all in that balance with blended learning book. It's like it's a really complicated puzzle of the metacognitive skill building and students starting to really appreciate the impact of the work that they're doing on themselves, their growth, their learning, their development. It's also about owning their progress with that conversation with the parents. It's about allowing students to advocate for themselves and rework pieces and reassess. And then I even write in that book about before I would spit out a grade, I gave kids an opportunity. Look at the grade book. It's digital, right? Does this feel like an accurate grade? And if not, submit a Google form with a request for a grade interview. So we can sit down, you can bring evidence that you think shows you've done work above and beyond. And in order to qualify for that grade interview, they can't have holes on key assignments. So they have to double back and fill those in before they even qualify for a grade interview. So it doesn't take very long for them to understand, I have agency in this class. I have agency over my grade, and I can decide what grade I get in this class by how much I'm willing to put into it. And that, it takes time, but it is such an exciting shift to witness as a teacher.
Yeah, it is the empowerment and the agency, as you say, and it's not the case where students are just blindly giving themselves grades,
No,
but
no.
they're having to make the case and they're having to present evidence. They're having to
Yes.
justify their claims, which is an important aspect of any self-assessment exercise, which is what makes you say that and what evidence do you have to support the claim. The way we would ask them to formulate an argument in any sort of writing situation or anything, they have to continue to do that. I also previously in your response, I also think that you've really picked up on a almost a double layered issue that we have around grading. One, of course, is the grading everything, which is problematic from a formative perspective and not giving that time for practice and that space to make mistakes and stumbles. But it's also the points, the idea of accumulating points versus a rubric or criteria which identifies gradations of quality versus sort of point accumulation. And I think that trying to address those two ideas, I think, are really critical in the work around assessment that really works nicely with blended learning for sure.
Absolutely. I think of that point accumulation. Like I just imagine kids like this Pac-Man game. It's like that becomes the point, right?
That's
Not
right.
the learning, not the
Yeah.
progress. And that's a
Yeah.
huge problem.
And I think, it's in fairness to students, one expression I use constantly is that what adults give their attention to is what students and teenagers eventually believe is important. And so if all we're ever referring to or talking about is points, 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 grades, 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 that's what young people are going to think matters to us. And they're going to have that cynical idea of, well, if you're not grading it, I'm not doing it, because that's what we've nurtured in our school. Kids don't come to school as grade grubbers. They don't even know what grades are in kindergarten. And then the system, we as adults kind of introduce the system to them and then lament the fact that when they're 15, they're asking us, how many points is this worth? We have to take some responsibility for that, I think. So, but anyway, we could talk about that for hours, I think, and lots of those issues. However, in fairness, I do think the conversations about grading are vastly improved from where they were a decade ago. I think more and more teachers are coming on with that. Okay, so let's finish up with a synthesis. Listeners, you've heard Catlin refer to many different models. She's talked about station rotation, et cetera. So Catlin, I'm going to ask you to sort of give us a synthesis of the four kind of main blended learning models that you talk a lot about in your books, et cetera. And let's start with the station rotation model. What exactly does that look like?
Well, it's looked really different this year and it's been so exciting. So let me just say all of the models that I have worked with teachers in the last 14 months, they're blended learning models, but you can think of them as nimble, right? They can fluidly go online. So I've done entirely virtual station rotations. They work beautifully in the physical classroom, or even now in these simultaneous concurrent classrooms, they're incredibly flexible, which is exciting. So when we think about station rotation, pre-pandemic, we're thinking about groups of learners in the classroom rotating through teacher-led, online, offline stations. And you might have 5 stations, 4 stations, 3 stations. It just depends. But it is that rotating. And this year, the adjustment that's had to happen is that, instead of a learn or a station being a physical location in the classroom, it's really just a learning activity, and students are shifting from one to the other. And the benefit is you take this larger class and you have smaller learning communities. Teachers have dedicated time to work with smaller groups of learners. It's easier to consistently differentiate. We can connect learners for conversation and collaboration, and they enjoy a higher degree of control over the pace of their learning at the non-teacher-led stations. So I love station rotation.
Yeah. You've mentioned it several times, and it definitely, you can see the personalization, the intimacy that you can get with smaller groups, having them rotate, also keeping activities fresh, et cetera. What about whole group rotation model? That's an interesting concept as well. What does that look like?
Yeah, so whole group actually in the initial taxonomy was called the lab rotation. The idea
Okay.
that the whole group would work offline in a classroom and then the whole group would rotate online in a computer lab. Well, now with
Okay.
one-to-one, carts of devices, we don't need to leave the physical space. So the idea is that the teacher is very intentionally rotating the entire group between online, offline, offline activities. And with those online activities, we have this opportunity to give students meaningful choice, whether that's I want to read an article, watch a video, listen to a podcast, or I'm going to log into this program and get my specific practice where I'm at as a learner. And then how is the teacher really strategically using that time when students are engaged in those online pieces to pull individuals, pull small groups, conferencing, feedback, reteach additional models.
Yeah.
So that one tends to be a little easier for secondary teachers to wrap their minds around. They tend to see station rotation as like an elementary kind of strategy, which it is not. It is universally helpful. But sometimes if I have a resistant secondary group, we'll start with whole group rotation because I think that one's a little easier for them.
Yeah. It's kind of a nice entry point to kind of get a feel for what a rotation might look like before you get into those stations. Certainly, the one that is probably most familiar to listeners and the one that is probably most, talked about, and I want to get to a second part of this in a moment, is the flipped classroom. So let's a synthesis of what a flipped classroom is, what it would look like, and then I have a follow-up question to that.
Yeah, so initially the flipped classroom was the idea that we're going to capture instruction, lectures, whatever, and make that available via video. And students would watch those at home for homework. And then that class time where we're all together could be spent in practice application where kids have teacher, peer support, because it's often during practice and application that they trip and they fall. And I tend to say flipped learning more than flipped classroom because I'm trying to get away from this connotation that we're sending all these videos home with kids, because I actually think there's a lot of benefit also in leaning on video strategically in the classroom. I think whenever we can give students that control over the pace, right? They can pause, they can rewind, they can watch it half a dozen times if they need to. That's going to be beneficial. And in my own work with schools and districts, I also really point out there are ways to make strong video content, but to really maximize its effectiveness, we have to build a complete learning experience around it. So like, what's happening before that video? What are we asking kids to think about? Or how are we asking them to engage when they watch the video? And then what do they do when they exit out of the video? So it's bigger than just video. And that's where I spend a lot of my time and energy in trainings, is kind of helping groups learn about how to maximize that experience.
So that was going to be my follow-up question, which was, you certainly on social media and other platforms, you hear people talk about, well, I do flipped learning, I do flipped learning, I do flipped learning, but cautionary tales about the idea of, say, flipped learning light, where people are making the assertion that I do flipped learning, but when you look at it, you realize it's really falling short of the promise of what a flipped learning experience should be all about. So if you were to give advice to teachers to try to avoid certain steps or to avoid certain things, or make sure you do that, I think what you just mentioned there is one of them. Any other sorts of advice that you might have so we can avoid flipped learning light?
Well, and I mean, flipped learning light is one thing, and I think of that as just throwing videos at kids and
Okay.
like asking them to watch it. And
Right.
we don't really know if they're thinking critically about the information in the video. But I also think there's like flipped learning heavy, which are these drag videos, which are way too long,
Right.
way too dense. It's like,
Yeah.
shorter videos are better,
Yeah.
period. So
Yeah.
really being focused in our videos and making maybe a few videos as opposed to one long video, because kids
Right.
just, it's hard for them to stay tuned into these long videos.
So one epic lecture on
Oh,
here we
yeah,
go,
too
fasten your
much.
seatbelts. Right. You've also mentioned a few times today the playlist, or kind of the individual rotation. So let's finish up by talking a little bit about that.
Yeah, so think about your Spotify playlist. You have one song after another, and a playlist for the classroom is similar. You have a collection of learning activities that students move through. I always have them move through kind of in order. So they're very intentionally placed in a specific order. And you might have a playlist that's like a novel study playlist. You might have a grammar playlist. You might have a science experiment playlist or a project-based playlist. Like, oftentimes I think teachers, or a 5 E's instructional model playlist, right? I don't think teachers always understand how like open the possibilities are. You might have a playlist that runs 2 days or 2 weeks. So
Mhm.
the scope can really change, but the idea is grounded in standards and skills, has very specific learning objectives. Kids are working towards some kind of a product. And
Mhm.
like I said earlier, I love to start by differentiating playlists, which is I always make 3 versions of a playlist. And then within each version of the playlist, so I have kind of my middle of the road, my advanced, for next level challenge, and then my
Yeah.
more scaffolded. But within it, those, I think those teacher checks and those conferencing moments, that's really where we have this opportunity to, like I said earlier, personalize a playlist
Mhm.
and make sure
Mhm.
it's continuing to meet students' needs as they progress through it.
Yeah. Love that. As we finish up here, Catlin, any final words of wisdom or advice for teachers now, if they're energized, they're excited, they've listened to the podcast, they're ready to explore blended learning and its possibilities? Any words of wisdom or pieces of advice you might offer them?
I mean, I'm thrilled if they're excited. What I will say to teachers is I know it's felt like this year is just one thing after another that's new. But with blended learning, with these models, what I see as an opportunity is for teachers to build their teaching tool belts where they have multiple models so that as they move forward, whether they're in class, they're online, it's a combination of the two, they have this really nimble skill set and tool set where they can say, what is the objective of this learning experience or this learning cycle? And which of these models is going to be most effective? Because I still think there are a lot of teachers who are basically reaching for the same model every single time because that's all they have. And it's like they're trying to make that one model work for all of these different things that they actually need to get done. And so for me, it's about let's build this tool belt that allows us to be successful regardless of the teaching and learning landscape that we're
Yeah.
functioning in. And that's what I think blended learning can help us to do.
Yeah. My advice to those wanting to explore blended learning is to read Catlin's books and follow Catlin on Twitter, and you will definitely get an education in what blended learning is all about. Fantastic. Uh, Listeners, I will mention at the end the ways that you can follow Catlin and her website and all the ways you can connect as well. But Catlin, this has been great. Really enjoyed the conversation. We're going to finish up today with a bit of a fun segment. 3 questions I always ask everyone I interview. Just a chance for us to get to know you a little bit on a more personal level. Nothing too intrusive, but a way to kind of get some insight as to how Catlin thinks about things that are just not that important. All right, here's the first one, and this is a would you rather. Would you rather go into the past and meet your ancestors, or go way into the future and meet your great 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 grandchildren?
I would rather go into the future and meet my great great grandchildren.
Okay. Any reason? Any particular reason why you'd want to do that?
Well, my sister just had her first child, so I'm an auntie for the first time. And
Okay.
so I'm just enjoying being around a fat little baby. And so the idea of meeting a fat little baby in the future that came
Yeah.
from one of my children's children is
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
exciting.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah. There's nothing quite like that, that newborn, just everything about it. That's definitely something that's a draw for all of us as aunts and
Mhm.
uncles for sure. Okay. Number two, what famous person, actor, musician, athlete, what famous person, if you met them, would immediately turn you into a pre-adolescent? It would just make you absolutely just a fangirl over them.
So embarrassing. It would be Maya Angelou. And I would be so embarrassed by my behavior in front of her because oh my gosh. I mean, Maya Angelou, her books, I've taught I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings so many
Yeah.
times. I had to go to bat to keep teaching that book because people wanted to censor it out of our district. And I was like, no, it's Maya Angelou. And like, I'm so sad when she died, but like listening
Yeah.
still to her interviews and
Yeah.
her reading her poetry. I mean, I think I would just be so speechless. It would be embarrassing.
I was going to ask you, you said you'd be embarrassed. I was curious as to what exactly that would look like, but
I
I
would
think
be
you've,
stammering like a
yeah,
total fool, just like,
yeah, yeah,
I can't
yeah,
believe it's her.
yeah. It's amazing how there are those people in the world who turn us into, children,
Yeah.
as full grown adults. They turn us into children. Last question. What's your favorite way to waste time?
Oh, I'm terrible at relaxing and wasting time. I think the closest I get to wasting time, and it's not wasting time, but is just on my daily like walk with my dog, which is
Mm,
just the time when I get to like get outside of my head and be
mm,
outside. But it's not wasting time because I'm being active, but
yeah.
yeah, I wish I was better at relaxing. I really am not. My sister's amazing. She can
Yeah.
like chill on the couch, watch Netflix, and I just
Yeah.
don't. Yeah,
Yeah, it's hard.
struggle.
Well, I don't know what her line of work is, but I would imagine it's with the work you do, Catlin, you're always, it's always available. There's always an email. There's always
There's
something you
always
can do.
something to
So
do.
it is definitely hard. Okay, one final question as we finish up today, and it's a question I ask everyone I interviewed so far, and will continue to do so. And it's a question about success and happiness. It's a theme I'm trying to run through the podcast and thinking about just what success means to us. So the question is, quite simply, if a stranger stopped you, if a random person stopped you on the street and asked you, what is your definition of success? How would you answer them?
When I feel most successful is really when I have been asked to do something, given an opportunity that I've been scared of, that's been daunting, that I really didn't know whether I could do it. And my knee jerk response was to want to say no. And I did it anyway and was successful. Like I saw it through, or I did the thing I was scared of, or I wasn't sure I could do. And it's always in those moments where I'm like, wow, I'm so capable. I feel so successful.
Yeah, I love that idea of overcoming the fear and coming out on the other end and having that feeling of accomplishment, and certainly gives
Hmm.
us more confidence, or a little more confidence going into those moments
Hmm.
going forward for sure. Listeners, you can follow Catlin on Twitter. I would really encourage you to do so. Her handle is at Catlin_Tucker. You can always also follow Catlin on Instagram. It's at Catlin Tucker. And her website as well, www.catlintucker.com. Catlin is also the host of her own podcast. It's called The Balance. So, Catlin, tell listeners a little bit about the podcast, what listeners can expect when they hear the podcast.
So, as a person who struggles to relax and struggles with balance, I really wanted to shine a light on this topic. I know most teachers really struggle with that work-life balance. There's so many demanding aspects of this work that we do. And so I bring experts on, we talk about all manner of things, but we always tie it to this idea of balance and striving for a healthier balance in our
Yeah.
lives. So
Yeah.
I feel like I learn as much from the guests as probably the listeners, but I think
Yeah.
it's such an important topic to shine a light on.
Yeah, absolutely. It is. It seems more than ever challenging to find balance in our lives because there's this 24-hour, 7-day a week social media cycle, news
Hmm.
cycle, everything that's going on. So, and so listeners, really encourage you to take a listen to The Balance, featuring Caltin and some great guests. You've had Katie Novak on recently, Jay
Hmm.
McTighe on, and Jay was on this podcast as well in February, and it was just a he's a
He's
wealth of
fabulous.
information for sure. Fantastic.
Yes.
Caltin, I really appreciate you being here. Thanks so much for joining me.
You're so welcome. Thanks for having me.